Ja, het is wat vroeg, maar je moet er wat voor over hebben als je een whisky-legende mag spreken. Dus ready for take-off. London, here we come. Dit is Drop or Dram, de podcast voor whiskyliefhebbers. Van beginner tot kenner. Schenk je favoriete glas in en luister met ons mee. En dan zit ik hier midden in Londen. En dan denk je, Londen, ja, dat heeft niet zo heel veel te maken met whisky. Maar toch, ik ben op bezoek in Chiswick Studios in Londen. Bij toch wel een whisky-legende. En die legende die zit tegenover me. Ik ken hem al jaren en hij heeft een van de allermooiste merken opgezet. All by himself, misschien nog een beetje onbegrepen, maar ik zit hier met John Glaser, echt wel een legende in de whiskymakers wereld. En ja, we gaan eens even praten met hem om te kijken van wat hem nou gebracht heeft om dit zo te ontwikkelen. We praten hier over blending, we praten over Compass Box, we praten over the future of whisky. John Glaser. So good to see you and thank you very, very much for having me. This podcast, it's all about whiskey. And one of the first things when we started out with this podcast was I need to have some legends in there. And I see you smiling and you're too modest in this, but you're a true legend. John Glaser, welcome.
Well, thank you, Dennis, and it's really nice to have you back here in London after many years. You haven't been here in a long time, but it's so nice to be with you. Thanks for all the kind words.
Well, thank you. Talking about John Glaser, I met you years and years ago, just when you started the company.
At the beginning,
Compass Box.
20 plus years ago, we met.
Yes, Compass Box. Not a very obvious name for whiskey. How that came about?
Well, that's the point, really. That was the point when I decided to name the company Compass Box. I wanted to name it something that was not expected in Scotch whiskey. I didn't want it to sound like we were trying to be a company that has existed for 150 years. I wanted it to sound like a business that was of its day, of today. And I just loved this idea of the compass box, where the ship's captain would keep his compass when he was sailing. The compass box.
So you were looking into the future and heading a new direction and heading your compass that way?
That is a lovely and poetic way to put it, Dennis, yes.
Yeah, because you came from the whiskey industry in the first place, because it's not overnight when you started Compass Box as a whiskey.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. Yeah, well, some people, your listeners might be able to tell I've got an American accent and not a Scottish accent, not an English accent. I moved over here 25 years ago, 98 I guess it was, when I moved over here from the U.S. I'd been working for Johnny Walker in the U.S. and they moved me over here to the U.K. So yes, I was in the whiskey industry before starting Compass Box, but it goes back. My interest in making things goes back further than that, because when I left university years ago, my ambition was to be a winemaker. And I worked in the wine industry for many years, and I went to France and California. And, life is not a straight line. It's a squiggly line, as we all know. You and I know well. And my squiggly line, instead of getting me into the wine business, got me into Scotch whiskey. And I thought I was going to do it when I got this job with Johnny Walker in the U.S. And maybe I thought I'd do this for a little while and then go back to wine. But here I am all these years later.
And you started out on your own kitchen table with a dream of making your own whiskey in a certain kind of way, a peculiar way. And I remember from your kitchen table, it went on to a real office below a hairdresser. That was quite funny to see that. But you started out with a dream, making whiskey, Compass Box whiskey. Mm-hmm. What was actually your goal of making whiskey? Because it's not like you can go out and buy a few casks and just pour it together and have a good whiskey.
Yeah, so I fell in love. I can describe the moment when I fell in love with whiskey, Scotch whiskey, and how that led to me to starting Compass Box. So if you can imagine the Isle of Skye, a place I know is near and dear to your heart.
Oh, definitely.
Your daughter's name. The Isle of Skye in 1995, it's January, it's Monday morning, it's around 10 a.m., and it's, typical of that part of Scotland. It's raining horizontally. It's dark. It's cloudy, and we go up. We come to the Talisker Distillery, and this is the first distillery in Scotland I've ever been to at this stage. And Monday morning in January, and we tour the distillery, and then we go into one of the warehouses, and the distillery manager at the time dips a cask. He says, "Here, we're going to sample a cask," and he takes draws a sample out of a cask. He puts it into this long, glass measuring cylinder. I don't know, it's like the length of my arm from my elbow to my fingers. It's about that length. He pours in the cask strength Talisker into this thing, a couple inches. And he says, "Go ahead, John, take a sample." And I slowly put this glass measuring cylinder to my lips, and I tip it up very slowly, and you can just start to see, because I've actually got this on video, Dennis. I can show you this later. So there's somebody with me that's shooting video.
I'm getting thirsty.
And you can see the amber liquid kind of rolling down, coming down the glass measuring cylinder, and it hits my lips and goes into my mouth. And I kind of jumped a little bit, because what was in my mouth was just so suddenly, so magical, so extraordinary. It was like, if you watch the video of it, it's like watching an epiphany. And I was just like nodding my head yes, nodding my head slowly yes, passing the measuring cylinder to the colleague that was with me. And that's the moment I fell in love with whiskey.
The magical whiskey.
That was magical indeed.
Yeah.
And at that point, I was working for, as I said, the big whiskey company, thinking, I'll do this for a couple of years and I'll go back to following my dream in wine. But that moment changed everything. And if that was 95, then it was about 5 years later, after I'd moved here to the UK, and I was spending a lot of time working with some legends in the industry. Talk about legends. These are real legends. Maureen Robinson, Jim Beveridge, Johnny Walker back in those days. And learning quite a lot, but also seeing that Scotch whiskey back 25 years ago needed help. It was not as dynamic as it is today as an industry. Global sales were flat or declining depending on the year. Yes, single malts were growing, but they were very small, and consumers perceived them to have rules. You only have to do it a certain way, and they weren't making up for the big brands that were in decline. And I just thought, there's another way to do whiskey. And I borrowed some ideas from the world of wine, which I knew so well and loved, and thought, let's do things differently in Scotch whiskey. Let's start a new business that will share the joys of what I realized was one of the world's great drinks back in that Talisker distillery. I realized it just I felt some help to make it more interesting to more people. And that was the basis on which I started this business, Compass Box.
And you made it a very, very exciting business because, yes, back in the days, the 1990s up to the millennium, whiskeys were there. And like you said, single malts were growing slowly, got to know, not where they are today, where it's so well known and all the big brands are putting out different finishing, beautiful, great things, but very conservative in some sort of way. And you made a difference. The blends were back in the days were the one to drink, the things to drink. Single malts was just slowly creeping up because people didn't understand, I think, single malts. It was way too smoky, too soft, everything too.
Right.
And well, what I got from what you were thinking and with Compass Box, you thought, well, if there's all those great, beautiful things out there, let's replicate or duplicate or, well, innovate something beautiful new.
Yeah.
So that was a bold move because that was different than to the other blends. And that's what I wanted to really, really talk about you. I say you're a legend in the whiskey industry. I see you as a master blender. Master blender puts whiskeys together and makes a beautiful painting from all those different colors, a beautiful painting. You call yourself, you had another word for that, whiskey maker, more creative.
Yeah, the master blender is not a term that we use. There's no certificate you can get that makes you a master blender. It's more or less a marketing term in the industry. That's okay. But we prefer to talk about being a whiskey maker. We're more than blenders. We're not distillers, at least not at this point in our business life, but we're more than blenders. You know, we think a great deal about what we are trying to create. We create whiskeys with real intent. And let me just talk about that for a little bit, if you don't mind, because there's a part two to that story I told you about the Talisker Distillery. And on that same trip back then, at the end of the trip, I ended up in the blending room of what I would regard as a real master blender. And Maureen Robinson introduced me to blending in the blending room back in those days. And so I went from these distilleries where I was captivated by what they were making to this blending room. And around the room were dozens of little nosing glasses, each with different colored liquids in them. And, you know, I don't remember what she was doing exactly that day, but obviously she was assessing samples of casks or samples of prototype blends. But what hit me when I saw all these tiny little bottles of individual cask samples and looking at the work that she was doing, this captured my imagination, because what I was thinking is, now these individual products are fascinating, but now bringing them together and blending to create something that no single distillery can create, that to me is creativity, and that to me is exciting, and that to me is how so many of the great drinks of the world are made. Even people, you know, coming from the wine business, people think, oh, a single vineyard wine. But, you know, the best winemakers, even when they're bottling their single vineyard wine, they're still blending the barrels from the best sites within that single vineyard. They're declassifying the others. Blending is so misunderstood by so many people. It really is about creativity. It really is about creating something that is yours, that comes from the individual's mind. And that set me off on the path of realizing that blending is what I wanted to do with my career.
Yeah, I think we can come back to that later and see, like, blending is an art, and you can show me some of the things that you do and how to create some of those beautiful whiskeys and the way you think about those things, because that's I guess that is a whole episode on its own. And for our listeners, that's interesting enough, and you can listen 2 or 3 hours to this guy and seeing him at work. But we'll come back to that later on. But great thing, the creativity. I really, really loved the way you talked about your passion of seeing all those beautiful colors, flavors around there in bottles, but also your way of thinking from great distilleries can make great whiskey, but putting things together and make even a better one or a different one, that is something only men can do and only people can do. So
yeah,
the great gift of whiskey is more than just a single malt or just...
Yeah, I think a single malt can be, the best ones can be a celebration of a place. And the best blends are a celebration of an idea. There's an intent behind them. And I think it's different. And I think that's why blends, I think, can be more of a in a sense, could be almost more communal. They're bringing things together and celebrating an idea, as opposed to the paradigm of place. We're talking about the paradigm of the maker, and there's more story there, I think, for me anyway.
Yeah, very poetic. You should write a book, John, because that sounds very, very good. But this gives us a whole new ideas. Talking about creativity, talking about Compass Box, the brand you started, and the way you like. You're also a little bit of a rebel or innovator. It's just the way you see it. You had your troubles with the SWA, Scotch Whisky Association, with doing things that they didn't approve of. Is that you were way ahead of your time looking into the future, or is that conservative about the SWA, or is that not quite right, the right time in the right place?
I've never thought of what we do I've never thought of us or myself as a rebel. And I know people have said that over the years. I think of us at Compass Box as heretics, not rebels, but heretics. And I will hasten to add heretics with positive intent. So you can be a heretic and with, not necessarily positive intent, but we are heretics with and what I mean by that, and the differentiation is, or the difference is, rebels are very much rabble-rousers, often trying to make trouble, sometimes just for the sake of it. We're heretical in our thinking. We will challenge the status quo when we think it's right to do so, when we think there's a positive potential outcome, when we think the status quo no longer is fit for purpose. And so we have had some run-ins over the years with bodies in the industry about techniques we've used or wanted to use, or the way we've talked about and described our products, but never to just make trouble, never to just rattle the cage of someone, always because we thought it was the right thing to do for the industry and for whiskey drinkers. And that's a difference. That's the difference between being a rebel and being a heretic with positive intent.
That makes much more sense. But also, you're also, every time you make a whiskey, and you have over the years done so many beautiful things. Which one was the first ever produced whiskey? The first label you put out.
The first Compass Box whiskey I produced was Hedonism, our grain whiskey, 100% Scotch grain whiskies. It was a blend of different distilleries. The first one was just 2 different distilleries, Cambus and Caledonian, 2 now closed grain whiskey distilleries. That was the very first whiskey I created and bottled when I started Compass Box. And what I was trying to do then, is just show people a side of Scotch whiskey that not many people then were familiar with. And today, many people are still not familiar with what good quality Scotch grain whiskey can taste like. There's a lot of grain whiskey made in Scotland. Most of it's not very interesting. But when you seek out the really good quality casks, we like first filled bourbon barrels, ex-bourbon, ex-American whiskey barrels to age our grain whiskeys. They can be some of the most beautiful, soft, sweet, approachable, lovely, delicious whiskeys you can find in the world, I think.
Grain whiskey is very misunderstood. Back in the days when you started with the juveniles and the grain whiskey, weren't they quite old grain whiskies?
Yeah, with Hedonism, yeah. The first one was, that very first batch back in 2000 was just, it was a small batch of 10-year-old Cambus grain whiskey and 20-year-old Caledonian whiskey, grain whiskey. And to this day, Hedonism is true to that style. It's always a blend of different ages. It tends to be in the neighborhood of 18 years old in terms of average age, but it is both younger and older whiskeys coming together to create complexity and balance.
And now we got a lot older ourselves, so age is just a number.
Age is just a number indeed.
It has to be matured fully.
Well, 3 years minimum.
To be understood.
And then, the whole thing about whiskey, older is not better, it's just different, right? Same with so many things. Same with wine. Older is not better, it's just different.
What is your point of view on grain whiskies in the future. People tend to do, how do you say that? Different styles, aromas, flavors, changes over the years by when you're getting older, when I'm getting older, the way I think about life, the way we travel around the world, the way news comes to us, everything changes so fast. But it also, I think, makes your perception to the world differently, and also, according to that, changes my taste in life. To grain whiskey, well, we're talking about grain whiskey now, but I guess it's about all those whiskeys. The whiskeys I liked 20 years ago and I do now, maybe, back in the old days, everything was better. Was it? Or is the near future holding so many new things and we have to keep an open mind?
I think that's exactly it. We need to keep an open mind. Things in the past, were they better? Maybe on some measures. They were certainly different. I think that's the same thing moving forward. Will things in the future be better? I don't know if they'll be better. Depends on how you measure it. They'll certainly be different. The industry is always evolving, even though Scotch whiskey is thought of as a traditional old industry that doesn't change fast. I think that's largely true compared to some other industries, but it certainly is evolving. And you were asking about grain whiskey. I think we will see over the next decade or so, more businesses working with grain whiskeys, bottling grain whiskeys on their own. And I think we'll see, certainly we have an interest in looking at how you distill grain whiskey in Scotland. There's a conventional way to do it. But there's so many tweaks and changes and, and different ideas you could bring to the distilling of grain whiskey in Scotland. I think we're just scratching the surface in terms of what we might see distillers, perhaps ourselves included in the future, doing over the next 10 or 20 years with Scotch grain whiskey.
And also on single malts?
Certainly with single malts, yeah. If you read Dave Broom's book, A Sense of Place, beautiful book, I think it really, he profiles in that book several of the new distilleries in Scotland, new over the last 5-10 years, who I really think are going to be some of the most admired distillers in Scotland in the future. He's really profiling some of those distilleries, some people behind those distilleries that they're at the leading edge of where Scotch malt whiskey distillation is going today and into the future. He profiles the Thompson brothers in Dornoch. He profiles Ardnamurchan, and I think that when you look into what they're doing and how they're doing things differently, you start to see something similar to what's going on in the world of wine right now. And in the world of wine, you've got conventional winemakers and big wine brands, and you've got winemakers that are moving toward more natural winemaking. And I won't get into the discussion of what that is. People can look into that themselves if they're not familiar. But essentially, it's rethinking all the conventions of winemaking over the last 50 years. I think we're just beginning to see that in Scotch whiskey and malt distilling in Scotland today.
Super interesting this is. Talking about making your whiskeys, because you as a whiskey maker, I won't call you a master blender, you're still a master to me, but I'll call you a creative whiskey maker. That's how the way you profile the company as well and the brand, and people can, and they certainly have to do that and look online, go to the Compass Box website, because you have great videos on more or less an online whiskey school where you can be very transparent on the way you make whiskey, how you put things together, and people can understand a lot more about whiskey in general, and especially in Compass Box. And I really, really love that. But that's also one of the key things I wanted to talk to you about, transparency. You're always been a man that transparency is one of your highest priority. Some would say very bold move, giving away secrets to competitors. or not. But the things you put in the bottle, you never held any secrets back to anything. You're very, very transparent. Also got you into trouble sometimes. Again, but I think you're one of the greatest whiskey minds in the world, and also the most misunderstood one because of that. I got you highly rated, but I think people can get that now. So it's still an honor to be here. But transparency, how did that come about? Dit is Drop or Dram. Magical word to you, one of your highest priority. Like I think and I said before, is it giving away secrets, or do you have other intentions with it? Because that is one of the key points of Compass Box. You can look on your website, go to your favorite brand or bottle, and you can see what's in there. You don't hold any secrets, not for competitors, not to anybody else. That is something different. Why are you so transparent in that way?
Well, because people have a right to know how the products that they are drinking and enjoying are made, but also because, I want people to think about the idea, the intent behind what we're doing, the creative process behind what we're doing. We're not just bishing stuff together, throwing stuff together that we have to hand, to make what we make. It typically takes 6 months for James and myself to create a new recipe, whether that's a limited edition whiskey or that's a new part of our core range. Orchard House, one of the most recent additions to our core range of whiskeys, took us over a year to create that. And that was dozens of different recipe ideas, we call them iterations, different prototypes, that we would assess and taste and then talk about and then say, well, maybe if we change this or change that. And that is months of work. And sometimes we're saying, okay, well, let's swap out this particular ingredient in the recipe, this particular single malt or this grain whiskey. Let's take it out and let's use something else. And you have this creative process becomes a journey. And we have this quotation. I'm going to look up at it right now here in our new blending room. And it's attributed to Picasso, but that doesn't matter who it's from. It's the idea. It says, I begin with an idea, then it becomes something else. I begin with an idea, and then it becomes something else. Attributed to Picasso. That very much describes the whiskey making process for us. It is this creative process where you start with an idea, and then you follow it. And sometimes it takes you down the path you're expecting. Sometimes it takes you down a different path. There's a lot of work and thought behind it. And that's why one of the reasons we're so transparent. We want you to know where we landed in terms of a recipe. We want you to know the story of the creation of this whiskey. Buying a Compass Box whiskey is more than just getting the liquid in the bottle. That's the most important thing, but you're also getting a story and a journey, a creative journey that was required to make this thing. Transparency is just part and parcel of all that, I think.
And talking about stories, every whiskey has got a great story, and the more whiskeys you drink, the greater the stories become. You make your own adventures, and I think that is a great thing. Keep on dreaming, and you dream big. You dream very big, because I've seen all those bottles and all those great things that you put together. But also, maybe not well understood, is you've got the most beautiful labels and with the most exotic names in there. Just a quick word on where the names and the labels come from. And then on this, we'll definitely make a bonus episode from that. We'll go and have a taste and talk through labels and talk through names on the deeper side to understand even better. But just a quick thought: how did you come about names, labels, because we're talking about Peat Monster, probably the most obvious one. One of your signature ones is the Artist Blend and the Gas Cloud Blend. But Spice Tree, Hedonism, you got the Circus, you got the Orchard House, Flaming Heart. Wow, it doesn't strike to me when people say that, or maybe even our listeners that are just getting into whiskey, as a very conventional whiskey.
Yeah, we don't take a conventional approach. And I realize that means that some people look at a Compass Box whiskey and they don't get it. They're like, well, wait a minute, this isn't telling me the things that these single malt brands tell me. And that's okay, because while we have our arms wide open to the universe of whiskey drinkers out there, and we encourage people to open their minds and learn things from what we do and enjoy what we do, we realize that we're not for everybody, and that's okay. And the unconventional names is just a part of who we are, who I am personally as the founder of the business, who we are as a group of people as Compass Box. And it's how we set ourselves apart. There's this, the Grateful Dead is this, maybe some of your listeners are familiar, maybe not, an iconic rock band in the US and around the world in the 60s and 70s and 80s and into the 90s. And one of the founders, Jerry Garcia, used to say, allegedly, that he said, don't try to be the best at what you do in life. Be the only one who does what you do. And I've taken that to heart. I really have.
Yeah. So you came up with exotic names that doesn't certainly imply to what the spirit is about. We'll go into that further when we taste some of your beautiful, beautiful expressions in a bonus episode where people can listen to it. I must say, if you're listening to this podcast, and don't put you off. If you're just a novice drinker and you've been hearing what John had to say and you got those exotic names and don't understand whiskey well, this is not a whiskey only made for experts or geeks, nerds like I am. This is very, very, very much a whiskey to be discovered, make your own adventures, and also for the novice, because like you said, you're very transparent what is in there. You've got a palette from Glasgow blend, artist blend, but also very exotic blends. Maybe a little bit more on the expensive side, but okay, this is value for money. But I think it's fair to say that we don't want to put the novice drinker, whiskey drinker that just came into whiskey off. As you see those labels and names.
No, not at all. And one of the things I have found in certain parts of the world is because we take an unconventional approach to other Scotch whiskey makers, that actually attracts some people to us who aren't as interested in the conventional approach and the traditional labels. You're absolutely right. That we're not trying to. We are try to be as approachable as possible, but through in an unconventional way. And that's just our way.
Well said. And as I said, you should write a book. You're so transparent in the way you're thinking. One day.
There's one other point on that is that, and at the risk of sounding, like I'm tooting our own horn, so to speak, what people will discover with our whiskeys is that, if they taste them side by side with similarly styled whiskeys on the market, even though we're blending from different distilleries, that doesn't have any impact on quality. In fact, arguably it can enhance quality by trying to create complexity and balance. We're proud to say, not ashamed to say, that our whiskeys stand shoulder to shoulder with some of the best single malts in the country, in all of Scotland and the world. Yeah, we take an unconventional approach, so that might not seem self-evident to some people. But, we know that we do. and it's been corroborated and by lots of people over the years, and we know, because we know whiskey. We have closets filled with whiskeys from around Scotland and the world, because we love whiskey too, and we're always trying to benchmark against what we think are some of the best whiskeys out there in the world. So we're enlightened about that, and not satisfied with putting anything out there that we don't think can stand shoulder to shoulder with the
No
best.
shortcuts.
No, absolutely not. And the thing about price, yeah, sure, some of our whiskeys are more expensive than other brands. If people could come here to London like you are, and come to the blending room and see the work that James and I and our whole team put into creating these things, taking months to labor over a new recipe, and then the painstaking work we do in blending in Scotland, in the bottling process, they'd see that, if you ask me anyway, we should charge more, because we're putting so much more blood and sweat and tears into what we make than, a brand that comes from a big industrial producer.
Well said, John. Well said, John. I think also for all our listeners out there, we'll definitely make another episode about blending, and blending is an art, and you can take us through the art of blending and making stories, proteges, and how it all comes about. So, yes, you're going to hear a lot more from John. But thank you very much for having me here. We'll go out there to the tables, because you've got a few bottles. So please listen to our bonus episode if you want to have more insights on Compass Box, on all those beautiful labels and flavors and aromas that are smiling towards me, and I can't really wait. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll be back. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Dennis.
Ja, John Glaser van Compass Box. Een man met een duidelijke visie, met een hele nieuwe, frisse kijk op het maken van whisky. Meer dan een whisky blender. En dat zie je ook terug in de prachtige namen Hedonism, Spice Tree, Spaniard, Peat Monster. Een man waar transparency hoog in het vaandel staat. Je mag weten wat er in de fles zijn, en alles is terug te vinden op de websites tot in detail. Maar een man die duidelijk een visie en een kijk heeft op de wereld van whisky op een frisse, nieuwe manier. En komt met de prachtigste, beste creaties die je maar kan bedenken. Het is dan ook een eer geweest om met deze man aan tafel te zitten. Maar daar houdt het niet mee op. Want zoals beloofd hebben we nog een bonusaflevering met John Glaser, waarin we dieper ingaan op een aantal van deze prachtige creaties. En hij ons alles gaat vertellen hoe hij die namelijk heeft samengesteld. En daar houdt het niet mee op, want we hebben lang genoeg met deze jongen over de tafel gezeten. Dus er komt nog veel meer materiaal aan. John Glaser, Compass Box, hou hem in de gaten en schuw dit merk absoluut niet. Het zal je naar nieuwe grote hoogte brengen.
Dit was Drop or Dram. Vergeet niet om je te abonneren op onze podcast of kijk op onze website www.dropordram.nl. Tot de volgende keer.